delved into it yet. The mules brought me their copy on Friday, and I actually took 7 instead of reading about 7.
So you did, what was the book? The Sabbath?
The Abraham Herschel book.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you like remember it all? Yeah,
Right.
sure. And I gave to wash my stuff, I went to the church. I turned it on. No, I didn't even know that.
But As folks are coming in, there are 2 boards in the back. If you have not given your thoughts on one or both of the boards in the back, there are 2 prompts. One of the boards is ways that you personally find rest and Sabbath, if you'll add your thoughts to that. And the other one is experiences of Sabbath in culture or society. So you can interpret that how you want it. Yes.
You know this group out here called the 12 Tribes?
No, I
They
don't.
run a great coffee shop. And a farmer's market in Hillsborough, wonderful. And they have a farm there. Their Sabbath is on Saturday. And I think they view themselves as kind of the original Christians. They're the original Christians.
Okay, we'll talk about that. Oh, you made it. I was Oh, I'm sorry. Oh. All right. I think we're almost ready. Yep, good. Thanks, folks, for adding your thoughts to the board there. All right. Okay. We have a video for our opener here. I'll get us started when we all are seated. So you don't miss the joke. I don't tell jokes, I'll let other people tell jokes. Mm-hmm. All right, so I'm starting with a clip from a documentary that was aired on PBS. I don't know how often it's in rotation. It's available all fully online if you Google it. It's by the filmmaker Michael Doublemeyer, who's done a ton of documentaries, particularly around religion in America. It's a rabbi. I'm not familiar with the rabbi, but he's telling a story of being at a conference with other rabbis.
I gotta tell you this story. We were at a hotel for Shabbat. And we made all the arrangements with the hotel, telling them that we can't use the electronic doors and the elevators and escalators. But one of the staff, one of the rabbis, ended up in a room on the 12th floor. So he has to take the steps. He can't use the elevator or the escalator. And then he has an electronic door. And he can't use that either. So he asks one of the staff members to meet him on the 12th floor and open the door for him. So the staff member takes the elevator, to the 12th floor, and he climbs 12 flights of stairs. And he meets him at the door. And the rabbi is totally exhausted. So the staff member says, what is it about today that you can't open the door? And the rabbi says, well, today is our day of rest.
We'll revisit this documentary in a little bit, but I thought that was a nice little icebreaker to, some of our ideas, right, that have built up not only in Christianity, right, but in Jewish tradition around Sabbath. There are as many ways to observe the Sabbath as there are denominations and iterations of Judaism and Christianity in particular, and are, of course, in other traditions as well. And it just highlighted one of those kind of funny dichotomies between like what happens in the real world and what, people trying to observe this ancient practice. So most of you have on your seats or in a seat near you a copy of some scriptures. There's a set from the Old Testament and there is a set from the New Testament, particularly the Gospels. And I thought we would read a couple of them. The first one I want to read, of course, is from Genesis. And I actually thought that this section was actually in Genesis 1. It's actually the first set of verses from Genesis 2. So we have all the days of creation, 1 through 6, told in Genesis 1. And for whatever reason, the rabbis and the church fathers decided that they were going to cut off the chapter right there and start the next chapter with the Sabbath day being created. So this is Genesis 2, 1 through 3. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day God finished the work he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work he had done in creation. I looked through the NRSV. There's a really great resource that some of you might use. This is a Bible browser by Aramus on the web, and you can actually search by keyword. So I searched Sabbath, and in the entirety of the Bible, including the Old Testament, the intertestamental books, sometimes called the Apocrypha, and the New Testament, there were 174 instances of the word Sabbath, and we're just sort of skimming and highlighting through. Of course, you heard in worship this morning, if you were in the 745, or you'll hear it again in the 10. We actually read the 10 Commandments as the Old Testament lesson today, Exodus 20. So you'll hear that next scripture listed there. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. It's also mentioned over and over again throughout the rest of the Torah and the prophets. You'll see one from Isaiah there. If you keep the Sabbath in this way, if I will feed you with the heritage of your ancestor Jacob. And then as we turn to the Gospels, we see a different approach and understanding of the Sabbath. The Sabbath becomes a point of contention between Jesus and the religious leaders at the time, and it almost becomes the last straw for the religious leaders. By the time they have their last confrontation with Jesus about doing something on the Sabbath that he shouldn't be doing, they are ready to kill him. And there are a couple here. There's one from Matthew. There's one of them is about plucking grain on the Sabbath. His disciples are hungry. That's the Mark on the second page that comes from Mark. I'll read that. There's a Matthew version as well. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost. And so are the skins. But one who puts new wine into fresh wineskins but one puts new wine into fresh wineskins. One Sabbath, as he was going through the cornfields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees, who were apparently watching them watch through this field, the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" And Jesus said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and he gave some to his companions." Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." That line gets quipped regularly when we talk about regulating the Sabbath. Not only in biblical times did Jewish law dictate that there ought to be some mandatory observance of the Sabbath by everyone, but of course we tried that in our own culture over the years to mandate that people rest on Sundays, sort of maybe, as we'll talk about. And that quote in particular, "The Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath." I wonder what that phrase might mean for you as you think about the way your week is built, right? So something to hold on to. Before we get too far along, there's a couple things I do want to say about Sabbath, and we'll delve into it a little bit more. So in American society in particular, I can't speak for other societies because I am not as familiar with the history and culture, but Sabbath really is a matter of justice in our society. We'll see some of that in the next clip that we watch. It's baked into our theology from the beginning in Genesis that those created in God's image are designed for a rhythm of labor and rest. All who are created in God's image. And Sabbath is important to this creative act given to us by God in building God's kingdom. So if we are to walk as Christians in the way and participate in God's kingdom, Sabbath is an integral part of that, not only personally, but for us as a beloved community as well. So I wanted to say those things as we move into the next clip. So we had, in the board back there, I had some of you put experiences of Sabbath in culture. And I can't see it. Father Chad, will you help me read it back there since you're standing there? So, church.
Music, prayers before sports events.
Interesting.
Stay home, in God we trust, and Sabbath throughout the weekdays. Seeing time set aside as sacred for Rabbi Heshe.
I'm surprised no one put things like blue laws and that kind of thing. Do folks have memories and experiences of blue laws in your state? Almost everyone on the eastern seaboard, if you grew up anywhere from New England to the south, you probably experienced this. There's a couple origins of those blue laws. Some of it is from Puritans in New England. Some of it is from the labor movement throughout the Northeast. And some of it is tied up with Jim Crow. So there's several origins of that sort of state-mandated Sabbath, right? You'll remember, I think Jeff was telling me he couldn't buy dog food on a Sunday because it was not a human consumable. Couldn't buy beer. You could buy beer, but you couldn't buy dog food. You couldn't buy hats or gloves or whatever else. This photo is from Texas, as you can see with the 10-gallon hats there. Couldn't buy things that were not, put in the body. And then in the South, of course, it was particularly used for a long time and still many places used to regulate alcohol sales. All right, so this next clip continues the discussion around the Sabbath and justice and around American society. And it's a clip later in the film, and one of the speakers is actually my Old Testament professor, mine and Chad's Old Testament professor, Dr. Judy Fentress Williams. And she's actually sitting in the parlor in the new chapel for the filming.
But there is a parallel story, because this was still a time when slavery was legal in many states. And while the majority of the slaveholders were Sabbath-keeping Christians, a Sabbath day of rest for those they enslaved was never guaranteed.
It should not be lost on us that these folks who practiced the Sabbath did not necessarily or always extend those rights to the people who worked in their households. And we could argue, in fact, that their observance of the Sabbath was supported by those folks who worked in their households.
One of the sad ironies in 18th century America comes in the form of the Philadelphia Liberty Bell. Carved into it is the saying, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land, unto all the inhabitants thereof." It's taken from the book of Leviticus, referring to the Sabbath idea of a Jubilee year, when according to biblical practice, all slaves are to be set free.
Every living creature is entitled to rest on Shabbat. We even have a concept in the Bible of the sabbatical year and the Jubilee years that are connected to Shabbat. The sabbatical year is every 7 years. There's a year of rest. And then on the 7th of the 7th year, the 49th year, there's a year of rest. And then there's a Jubilee year on the 50th year. It's the Sabbath of Sabbaths.
Yet for African Americans held in bondage, somehow the idea of a Jubilee year, a year to be set free, rarely comes to pass.
There was a debate in the antebellum period about the morality of slavery in general, of course, and critics of slavery in America often pointed to the Jubilee expectations about freedom for slaves and criticized American slavery for being perpetual. And they said, well, you say you're Christians, but you're not attempting to observe the Jubilee regulations about freedom after 7 years for the slaves. I am not aware of instances where Christian slave masters decided to free their slaves after 7 years because of the Jubilee regulations.
On different plantations, people were able to worship. Often there was what we would call the official worship, right? So that there would be a slave preacher who would come and essentially say to the slaves, slaves, obey your masters and you'll go to heaven. But I think one of the most powerful things that enslaved people did was worship on their own. To sneak out into the woods late at night after working 12, 14, 16-hour days, to worship freely in what they called the hush arbors or the brush arbors, to call out on their God on their own terms.
And so in a lot of ways, Sabbath was the one day that they experienced some dimension or element of freedom. They had a freedom to worship the God of their fathers, the God of their ancestors, and to call out to him together in corporate solidarity.
At the dawn of the 20th century, as the rights of workers began gaining ground, labor unions and Sabbath proponents found support in each other.
The labor union movement was usually very supportive of the idea of workers having Sundays off because they were so committed to the idea of limiting the maximum hours of work for individual workers. So in many ways, the labor movement in America is a surprisingly religious story, and it does often converge at the issue of Sabbath.
But that was for Sunday Sabbath observers. For those whose faith called them to honor a day other than Sunday, it could be a very different reality.
For the Jewish people, it is not an option. It's a commandment. And in many cases, Jews gave up their jobs, even gave up their lives, rather than violate the Sabbath.
And into the 20th century, black people continued to turn to the church and the Sabbath observance as sanctuary from legalized segregation and Jim Crow laws.
So that over time, church for Black people became everything. This is the place where I'm not wearing a uniform. So for some people, dressing up on Sunday was a huge deal. You weren't wearing whatever you had to wear to work in someone's house. In worship or in church on Sunday, African Americans had dignity. They not only got to dress up, but someone who was a nameless, faceless worker out there in a field somewhere got to be deacon so-and-so. And he got to sit up front and have a role of authority and assume a role that he could not ordinarily. So people who had to make their way through the world with their heads down and their shoulders hunched over got to sit up straight.
We had Black churches because Black people were not allowed into the white churches. But it became a place of community, a place to be loved. So the Black church that's a part of our history, but it's also a part of who we are right now.
All right. I have a couple discussion questions for us. So there's kind of a cluster of folks in the back here. There's some folks on the front row here. So if you want to get into groups of 4 or 5, however many sort of suit your space, why don't you 3 come this way and we'll make a cluster over here. How about that? Let's see. So the first question I want you to consider is how our views on rest and Sabbath different from the mainline culture compared to communities of color? And it's a really broad question. So, and you can reflect on what, the discussion about Sunday giving freedom to those worshiping together in communities of color. So the question is, how are views on rest and Sabbath different in the dominant culture compared to communities of color? Should I join a group? All right, take 30 more seconds and wrap up your conversation. All right, I'm going to bring us back to the full group. You can leave your current arrangements because we're going to talk about the others poster board over there in a minute. What are some things that came up for your group? Some observations, some thoughts, some wonderings. I heard lots of. It took us a minute to get going, but you were humming along there. This group over here. Yeah. Other thoughts? Yeah. Anybody else? Yes, that came up for us too. Yep, taken for granted. Or the other word that came up for us is we experienced church feeling like a duty, like something that you had to do. And that it wasn't, necessarily particularly celebratory. It was something you came and it had a finite beginning and a finite ending. And we highlighted that in a lot of African American churches, it can go all day. Kind of come and go. Other thoughts? Did you have good discussion? Yeah, okay. Uh-huh. Yeah. Uh-huh, yeah. Right, yeah. This attention to this contrast between the rest of the week, right, and Sundays. One of the other questions I wanted to ask, but we don't really have time to have a separate discussion of this, is about this idea of a Jubilee year. So I've always wondered, if we had something like that in, say, our current contemporary culture, what that would look like, and would the years in between those Jubilee years be different? Right, and what kind of, rhythms and thought processes would be different for us if we knew that in 7 years we were going to right all of the wrongs that we had done in the previous 6 years? Would there be less wrongs, right? I wondered about that question as well. That is in Leviticus, and if you want the reference to that explanation of what a Jubilee year is, I can get that to you. So.
Would you kind of define that again? Because I must say, I knew of this concept in terms of pharaohs.
Yes.
Reigning, but I had never heard this concept in the context of Judaism or us.
Yep.
So
Yep. So.
really no idea what it is.
Yeah, so this was one of the moments, so when we talk about like Mount Sinai and Moses, we usually think of Moses getting the Ten Commandments, but that wasn't the only time that Moses experienced God on Mount Sinai. So, and this is one of those moments. So God comes to Moses on Mount Sinai and he says, tell the people that when they come into the land, so this is really designed for when they come into the promised land, that they should observe a Sabbath. So every 6 years, you sow and toil and prune your vineyards and gather in your grain. And then for the 7th year, all of that work, all those 6 years, is preparation for a 7th year where you are supposed to rest and celebrate. But in the 7th year, there shall be a Sabbath of complete rest for the land. So it's also an agricultural mandate. So we know about resting our fields and things like that, right? It was an agricultural mandate as well, to work and toil for 6 years and then let the land rest. But God went beyond just the agricultural sort of sensibility and said that you shall not reap. So if you're not doing any labor, you don't need any laborers. So slaves were set free, livestock were set free. Chris, tell us how that might work. Yeah. And then there's like this whole cycle there's the 6 years of work, the 7th year of rest, and then after 6 cycles of that, there is a Jubilee year, which adds up to, 50 eventually. I don't do the math very well. Bible and math and me are not friends. But eventually it adds up to a Jubilee year, which is like a super Sabbath. I don't know that, ask a rabbi, because I don't know enough of the history of Israel to know whether that actually ever took place regularly, because there's not a ton of historical record around that. Will Abraham know about the Jubilee year? Yeah. Yeah. Right, yeah. Yeah, so one of the sources that you might use is not this book specifically. I don't know that he addresses the Jubilee year. I haven't delved in quite yet. Do y'all remember from any of him? No. Abraham Herschel, who's a Jewish scholar, has a beautiful book on the Sabbath. It's in the Education for Ministry program. It came to me on Friday, thanks to the Newells. And then, of course, others were mentioning it to me as we came in the door as a resource. But yeah, so I would say ask a rabbi if he knows or she knows if it ever came to fruition. Yes. Yep, there were absolutely, yep. It's all detailed in Leviticus 25. So I think most of the chapter. Yes. Yeah. We don't know if it actually happened or not, but that was that was what Moses got from God on Mount Sinai. Yes. All right, I want to move us into a discussion of the practice of Sabbath itself, not just, Sabbath on the whole, and how you as an individual or as how your family finds rest and Sabbath. So could someone read for me what is on the board back here? Mark, maybe. Thank you. Quilting. Yeah, and there's what, gardening and exercise, enjoy nature. Nice. That actually is mentioned in this book of spiritual practices. I recommend this book as well. It has more to do with broader spiritual practices. There's only one chapter about Sabbath. It's by Dorothy Bass. It's called Practicing Our Faith. It's a very accessible read, and you can go use it as a reference. You don't have to read it cover to cover. It came to me in seminary the first go-around in my spiritual formation class, and I'm not sure I've read every chapter yet either. There's one about testimony, and that's not really in my charism, so I haven't read that chapter yet. But she mentions that. So she talks about Sundays and how you might think about structuring your Sundays. And of course, it starts with going to church. And then it recommends that preachers and priests and pastors not schedule other things the rest of the day on Sunday, which is tough. I will say we do a pretty good job of not having more meetings in general. We have a one-off here and there, but we do primarily focus our time on formation and worship on Sunday mornings here. Other churches, sometimes Sunday's the only day where they can get everyone together, and they do have meetings. And then she recommends, so once you're done with church, go have a leisurely meal, go outside, go enjoy creation, really live into that relationship between Sabbath and creation. So that one is interesting that they put that on there. Who put that on there? Gardening and, thank you. You're reading my mind. Or you've read this book, one of the two. Wonderful. So that's interesting. I do have I have one more discussion question. I have a bunch of discussion questions, but we don't have time for all of them. So as a final discussion question, it's sort of two-part. So for those of you in the room that are still working, what does Sabbath look like for you? For those of you that are retired, what changed for you when you did retire? Did you find more space for rest and Sabbath? And when you left regular work behind? And then I wrote this down. Any parents in the room? And there are, which is great. I would love for you to talk a little bit about trying to find some rest amongst working and parenting, if that's plausible. Yes, your final discussion topic is, wherever you are in your situation in life, how do you find ways for rest and Sabbath? Sorry, we got one more from Wayne. Sure. Yes, the beginning of Shabbat. Yeah. We didn't really get into the details of this relationship between Shabbat and the first day of the week. I have it in my notes to talk about in the scripture section, but we were already running a little bit behind. Actually, there are, in the epistles, in the writings of Paul, so after you end the Gospels, the word Sabbath almost never appears. And there's only 3 references to early Christians worshiping on the first day of the week in any of those epistles as well. So it gets scant when we leave Jesus in the Gospels. So, okay, personal practices, and then we'll reconvene. take another minute. You're welcome. All right, 10 seconds to wrap up your discussion. All right, I'm going to bring us back to the full group. Did you learn any new practices from your neighbor? Did you get any ideas from the people in your group? Or was it, no? Was it hard to think about what your practices of rest and Sabbath are? Yes, I see a head nodding, yes. I'll admit I'm one of those. It's sort of hypocritical, because it's hard for clergy to find rest actually on the Sabbath. It's why we take another Sabbath and another day of the week usually. And some clergy are good about that and some are not. Does rest come easy for you? Yeah, now it does. Those of you some of you that are retired in the room are going, good. Why do you why do you say now it does? What was it before that made it so hard to find rest? So much commotion at home, yeah. And our world is just not built, right, anymore around quiet time, right? Yeah, it's really tough to carve out that space when we're demanded 40 hours a week at work and then take second shift, of course, when we get home, whether we've got kids or not, right? There's meals to fix and there's bills to pay. It's easy to let the whole week be filled with all of the things. Yeah. It even happens in retirement, yes. Right, yeah. So I want to close us with a blessing from, some of you were here on Thursday night, of this book that I really like to use by John O'Donohue. It's called To Bless the Space Between Us. And now having talked to Wayne on Friday and experienced a little bit of Abraham Herschel's perspective on the Sabbath, we could also say to bless the time between us, because Sabbath is about time as much as it is about sacred space, right? Sacred time as much as it is about sacred space. So this is for one who is exhausted. Let us pray. When the rhythm of the heart becomes hectic, time takes on the strain until it breaks. Then all the unattended stress falls in on the mind like an endless increasing weight. The light in the mind becomes dim. Things you could take in your stride before now become laborsome events of will. Weariness invades your spirit. Gravity begins falling inside you, dragging down every bone. The tide you never valued has gone out, and you are marooned on unsure ground. Something within you has closed down, and you cannot push yourself back to life. You have been forced to enter empty time. The desire that drove you has relinquished. There is nothing else to do now but rest. and patiently learn to receive the self. You have forsaken in the race of days. At first, your thinking will darken, and sadness take over like listless weather. The flow of unwept tears will frighten you. You have traveled too fast over false ground. Now your soul has come to take you back. Take refuge in your senses. Open up to all the small miracles you rushed through. Become inclined to watch the way of rain when it falls slow and free. Imitate the habit of twilight, taking time to open the well of color that fostered the brightness of day. Draw alongside the silence of stone until its calmness can claim you. Be excessively gentle with yourself. Stay clear of those vexed in spirit. Learn to linger around someone of ease who feels they have all the time in the world. Gradually, you will return to yourself, having learned a new respect for your heart and the joy that dwells far within slow time. Amen. Thank you all.